morning. If I could welcome everyone to GW's campus. Thanks for making it through in the rain. I'm sure we're going to have people straggle in as well as we proceed. But as you can see, we've got a stellar group of people to speak, and quite a few, so I want to take advantage of the limited time that we have. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Rhea Sears, momentarily, who is driving the internal efforts for GW to ensure that the whole is as great, if not greater, and in some cases much greater than the sum of its parts. GW has a ton of fantastic activity from the School of Engineering, from the School of Law, from the School of Medicine, from the School of Business, the School of Education. And one of our challenges, which I think is emblematic not only of GW but nationally, is how do you marshal and mobilize those various resources? How do you best integrate those various pieces? And how do you find those convergence points where you can look to the next breakthroughs, both from a science and technology standpoint and from an education standpoint? To give you a sense of how this has changed, just yesterday, I had an opportunity to sit down with two presidents of two of the finest education institutions, GW and Auburn, and you know that this issue's top tier, front and center, when you have presidents of universities discussing curricula, and in this case, curricula of cybersecurity, so it's pretty neat. And a lot of the discussion was very similar to the terrific Academies report that Diana led. Do we need more folks to deal with the APT threats at the highest end? Do we have a capacity issue where we need to be able to address the general workforce issues? Obviously, it's sort of like in a military sense, you need an army, but you also need special forces. You need both. And quite honestly, we all know that supply is much greater than demand in this space. I also just wanted to say thank you to one of our trustees who's made this most possible, Rick Knopp. And I'm going to turn it over to Rhea, who's got the fun job. And oh, by the way, when those presidents were talking, I was saying I could brag. I said, we got the best person at GW doing it, and I'll have better answers for you tomorrow after Diana shares those thoughts. So, Rhea, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I don't think a day goes by that we don't hear government or business leaders discuss their need for an agile, current, and skilled cyber workforce. But how do we get there? So today we're going to hear from GW's own Dr. Diana Burley, who will discuss her work on the professionalization of the cyber workforce. But before I introduce her, I want to introduce our outstanding panel, all of whom have very rich experience in this area. I'm going to start from the far end. Phil Reitinger. Phil is the Senior Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer of the Sony Corporation. I think as many of you know, Phil has been a leader in the cyber and information security community for years, having served as Director of the National Cybersecurity Center at DHS, certainly one of the most critical and challenging cyber positions in the government. He has also held key cybersecurity positions at the Microsoft Corporation, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Justice. Given his diverse background, he understands firsthand the challenges of developing a skilled cyber workforce. Next is Tony Sager. Tony is a founding member of the Council on Cybersecurity, an independent international nonprofit organization whose mission is to identify, update, and sustain best practices in cybersecurity by people in the application of technology and in the use of policy. He leads the development of the top 20 critical security controls, a worldwide volunteer consensus activity to find and support technical practices that stop the vast majority of attacks seen today. He also serves as director of the SANS Innovation Center, a subsidiary of the SANS Institute. He retired from the National Security Agency in June 2012 after 34 years of service there. His last position was Chief Operating Officer of the Information Assurance Directorate. He also created and led the Vulnerability Analysis and Operations Group, which was responsible for some of NSA's most important achievements in cyber defense. He's a passionate advocate for developing people and practices in the advancement of cybersecurity. Ron Layton. Ron was appointed to the position of Deputy Chief Information Officer for the U.S. Secret Service in the beginning of this year. He is responsible for information technology, strategic investment, and works closely across government, dealing with policy and operational issues in infrastructure protection, cybercrime, and intelligence. He also serves on the White House Cyber Interagency Policy Committee. Ron formerly served as the Deputy Director of DHS's National Cybersecurity Division and led the Secret Service's Electronic Crimes Task Force. He has lectured in many venues on cybercrime technology and critical infrastructure protection and has a very strong interest in developing our next generation of cyber leaders. Michael Papay. Michael Papay is the Vice President of Information Security and Cyber Initiatives for Northrop Grumman's Information Systems sector. He leads this company's cyber strategy development, and as you know, Northrop Grumman is one of the leaders in the cybersecurity community. He is a 26-year veteran of Northrop Grumman, and in his current position, he is responsible for strategy and vision for the company's global computer and network information security systems, as well as its policies and practices in information security. He has served on the 2012 Homeland Security Advisory Council's Task Force on Cyber Skills, and he is on the advisory board for the George Mason University School of Engineering. And as we mentioned, this morning we're going to start with our speaker, and she'll be followed by a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up for your questions. Our speaker today, Dr. Diana Burley, is an associate professor of human and organizational learning and our colleague at GW. She is truly a leader in the development of the cyber workforce and has worked in government, with private industry, and of course in academia to focus on a way ahead in building cyber skills. Most recently, she served as co-chair of the National Academy of Sciences Committee, Professionalizing the Nation's Cybersecurity Workforce, Criteria for Future Decision-Making, and was the co-author of its final report, which she will discuss today. She has also developed a new program, which I hope she will mention during our later discussion, called Holistic, the Seoul National Science Foundation pilot doctoral program designed to develop public sector cybersecurity leaders. Dr. Burley has written extensively on the social aspects of computerization. She has served as a program officer of the National Science Foundation. She was also honored by the Federal Chief Information Officers Council for her outstanding efforts towards the development of the federal cybersecurity workforce. We at GW are very proud to have a colleague that has already accomplished so much in building a world-class cyber workforce, and we're looking forward to hearing her thoughts this morning. Dr. Burley.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. I appreciate you coming out this morning. I understand that it started to rain just a little bit, or a lot. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to present to you the findings of our National Academy of Sciences Committee on professionalizing the nation's cybersecurity workforce. What I'd like to do is just take about 15 minutes to give you a very high-level overview of our process, and then speak to you about the conclusions and the recommendations that we made. The Committee on Professionalizing the Nation's Cybersecurity Workforce was sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security and the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, and our key sponsor, Mr. Montana Williams, is actually here with us in the audience this morning, so we're very appreciative that you were able to come. The task that we were asked to consider was really twofold. First, what is the role that professionalization might play in developing the capacity and capability of the nation's cybersecurity workforce? And second, what are the criteria for decision makers to use when considering that task? This time last year, the committee was formed and put together, and we are co-chaired by myself and Dr. Cy Goodman from Georgia Tech. In addition to Cy and myself, we had a number of leaders in cybersecurity education and workforce development. I won't go through their list of names, but I will refer you to the final report, which you can download while I'm speaking, from the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board, cstb.org, and you can download that report free of charge and follow along. I'm also told that we do have abstracts of the report that are out on the front desk for you to take a look at. The tasks that we were asked to consider should be considered within the larger context of the work that DHS is doing to consider this question of professionalization for the cybersecurity workforce. In order to develop the report and to gather inputs for our report, we went through a process that took us approximately 8 months. That process began with 3 public workshops. The first workshop was held in December of 2012 here in Washington, D.C. The second workshop was held in February of 2013 in San Francisco, California, alongside the RSA conference. For those of you who are unfamiliar with RSA, RSA is the largest national gathering of cybersecurity professionals. And the third workshop was held in San Antonio, Texas in March of 2013. The idea behind the workshops was that first we would have national coverage, so we would move across the nation to hear different perspectives from different constituency groups. And then within those workshops, we heard from employers at the federal, state, and local government levels. We heard from private sector employers, from very large corporations to very small enterprises. We heard from actual cybersecurity professionals across the spectrum of the different work that they do. We heard from human resource professionals, and we heard from students who would be future cybersecurity professionals. In addition to those 3 public workshops, we also gathered a broad range of reports, statistics, anything that we were made aware of or that we could find related to the development of the cybersecurity workforce. We held additional private meetings with individuals who had something that they felt that the committee needed to hear about. We had a public website where public comments could be gathered, and we would follow up on those comments. So we really did a thorough investigation. Once we wrote the report, we then had the report vetted by 12 independent cybersecurity experts, and Mr. Papay actually served as one of those experts to vet the conclusions that the committee had arrived at and the process by which we did so. So what was the result of all of this work? Well, the committee came up with 7 conclusions and a single recommendation that I will give you a very high-level overview of, and then we can have additional dialogue on. The first 2 conclusions are related to the capacity and capability of the cybersecurity workforce, both as it stands today and as it will be as we move forward. The first conclusion was simply a baseline conclusion that said that based on our efforts, there is in fact a need to continue to investigate and to continue to analyze and understand the nature of the cybersecurity workforce, that there is a significant need for additional cybersecurity professionals, and that we need to continue forward with these efforts. The second conclusion built upon that first conclusion and said that although we do agree that there is sufficient cause to continue to explore and understand the cybersecurity workforce and its development, the exact nature of that workforce, especially as we look toward the future, is unclear. There are many different reports that have been published that put estimates of the needed number of cybersecurity professionals at 10,000, 40,000, 50,000, 100,000. I even was at a meeting last week where they said we need 1 million. 1 million would do it. We'd be covered if we had 1 million. Without going into whether or not we agreed with all of those estimates, and some of which were difficult to find the source data to determine the validity of those estimates. It is also the case that the reports looked at different aspects of the field, and they all called for different numbers. So it's very unclear the exact nature of the scope. How many cybersecurity professionals will we need? It's not clear. The other piece of conclusion, too, that's unclear is related to the exact nature of the work that cybersecurity professionals will continue to do in the future. Technological advances like the cloud, where we're moving security as a service into a cloud environment that would change the nature of the work that the individuals within the organizations would need to do, also has implications for the size and the makeup of the future cybersecurity workforce. Our third conclusion has to do with the nature of cybersecurity work and the workforce. Conclusion 3 suggests that the cybersecurity workforce should be considered a field of occupations as opposed to a single occupation. There are many different jobs, many different occupations that are performed underneath this umbrella of the cybersecurity workforce. And the different occupations need to be considered differently when we consider mechanisms and methods for professionalization, or even the base question of professionalization. The fourth conclusion also relates to the diversity of the cybersecurity workforce and recognizes the fact that although we often talk about the cybersecurity workforce as if it were a single occupation and in fact a single technical occupation, it is not. Cybersecurity work goes from the very highly technical work to policy-related work to administrative work to the non-technical and everything in between, legal work, privacy considerations. All of these individual tasks make up the breadth of the cybersecurity workforce, the field of cybersecurity. And given that breadth and given that diversity, it is difficult to think of professionalization as a single method, as a single mechanism to professionalize all of these different areas in the same way at the same time. Conclusions 5 through 7 deal specifically with this question of professionalization and continue on the theme of breadth and diversity, because just like there are a number of different types of cybersecurity work and a need for various backgrounds of individuals performing those jobs, the idea of professionalization is also a very diverse idea. Professionalization is not a single idea. It does not come from a single method. There are, in fact, many different goals for professionalization. Professionalization is simply the process by which an occupation becomes a profession, where the individuals within that occupation are held to a particular standard of ethical behavior, are held to particular standards of minimal skill sets. It is a way for the members who are working in that profession to distinguish themselves from others who may be performing the task but who aren't designated as professionals because they're not credentialed as such. They haven't gone through sustained periods of training or apprenticeship. And so as we think about this question of professionalization, we have to recognize that the goals of professionalization vary. It could be that a field or occupations within that field are professionalized because there is some deficiency in the quality of the individuals who are performing the tasks. And if that is the case, then the mechanisms for professionalization need to be things like exams, something that would show that the individuals who claim to be professionals in that occupation do in fact have the requisite skill set. On the other hand, the goals of professionalization could be to increase the size of the workforce because there are insufficient numbers. The goals of professionalization could be to address some ethical standards or to address regulatory requirements, whether those regulatory requirements are related to the individuals performing the work or those regulatory requirements are related to the size and scope of the workforce. So because there are these different goals for professionalization, we have to be sure that the goals and the mechanisms for professionalization match the deficiencies within the field. Now, we recognize that this takes a long time. And in fact, our sixth conclusion relates to the fact that the path toward professionalization, the professionalization of an occupation, is slow and complicated, because it may be that the deficiencies within the field are complex. I don't think anyone would argue that in the cybersecurity workforce there is only one thing that we're trying to remedy through this question of professionalization. But what we are saying is that we have to take a moment to pause and to identify first the occupations, second, the deficiencies within those occupations that would be addressed through professionalization, and then to enumerate the goals for professionalization and apply the appropriate mechanisms to achieve those goals. Our seventh conclusion, taking all of those things into account, says that there are trade-offs to professionalization. And the costs and the benefits of professionalization need to be weighed against each other before moving forward on any effort. Even once you have aligned all of the deficiencies and the goals, you still have to weigh what are the benefits to professionalizing. Could be that the benefits are raising the standard of performance. It could be that they are enhancing public trust in the activities that those professionals are doing. But the associated costs must also be considered. Necessarily, when you apply additional standards, you restrict the supply. And at a time when we are saying that we need a significant number of new entrants into the field, we have to weigh the cost of restricting the supply with the benefits of adding additional professionalization mechanisms. This particularly came to light when we looked at a number of different occupations where we tend to think about the cybersecurity workforce as if individuals within that workforce, even across the breadth of different occupational categories, are solely focused on cybersecurity work. And what we found through our report, through our data gathering, and is highlighted in the report, is that many of the individuals within the cybersecurity workforce are in fact hybrid cybersecurity professionals, where cybersecurity is simply one aspect of their job. And so as we think about professionalization requirements, we have to keep in mind that for those individuals who are in these hybrid roles, they have professionalization requirements on the other aspects of their jobs as well. So that's what we mean when we talk about the trade-offs, considering the costs and the benefits. So considering those 7 conclusions that we came to in the report, our committee moved forward with a single recommendation. And that recommendation is that entities, be they government entities or not, who are looking to professionalize the field of cybersecurity should focus on the occupation, on individual occupations within that field, and should move forward with professionalization activities when 3 criteria are met. The first criteria is that the occupation has well-defined and stable characteristics. Can we, in fact, identify someone who is performing that job against someone who is not? Is the base body of knowledge within that particular occupation stable enough to warrant mechanisms that would assess whether or not someone meets those standards? Or by the time that we or the experts within that particular occupation agree on what those standards of performance ought to be, will that base knowledge have moved and shifted to something else? So the first criteria is determining whether or not the occupation has stable characteristics. The second criteria is that the professionalization mechanism does in fact meet the deficiency that has been identified within that occupation. If the deficiency is one of quality, we don't want to apply professionalization mechanisms that really don't assess whether or not an individual within that occupation has the quality that we need them to have in that field. We often pointed to the requirement within the federal government that even entry-level technicians have a bachelor's degree, when in fact we have many students coming out of community college system in cybersecurity related majors where they could in fact perform and perform well the requirements of those positions. But yet we have a professionalization standard that is not addressing the deficiency, and that in fact is causing a cost as opposed to benefiting the federal government. And that in fact also leads me to our third criteria, which is professionalization mechanisms should be applied only when the trade-offs are considered, and in fact the benefits to those professionalization mechanisms outweigh the costs. As we move forward, we have put forward specific questions within the report that decision makers can use surrounding those 3 criteria for decision making, so that they can then determine for each individual occupation when it makes sense to move forward for professionalization. And with that, I will open for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for a very comprehensive look at the report. And before I open it up to the panelists, because I want to get people to begin with, get the overview thoughts in terms of what we agree, what we disagree. I thought maybe, Mike, I wanted to ask you if you had anything you wanted to add as the sponsor of that, and why you saw the great demand, which I'm glad you did, to be able to work on that.
So the genesis of this effort evolved out of the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education component number 3, which is workforce structure. And as we began, as NICE began to evolve out of what was old CNCI, the Comprehensive National Initiative for Cybersecurity, Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, and moved out towards the nation, we began to talk to many stakeholders. And one of the first questions out of everybody's mouth was, how are we going to produce a agile, diverse cybersecurity workforce who can address to address the economic and security concerns of this country? And in that light, we begin to really look at, okay, how has other professions improved themselves? And I don't want to take much time because these people have a lot of great stuff to say, but I'm gonna use this anecdote, and I want you to kind of, as you begin to think this process, use this as kind of a background piece of reference. As we all know, in the 1950s, post-World War II, the airline industry itself, and even before that, the medical industry struggled with making sure that they had qualified technical people to do jobs. So doctors, doctors and pilots. Usually involved with some type of man-to-machine interface in many cases. Techniques that were perishable in their skills. So the medical profession, historically, and I want to take one step back, as we moved west and the Homesteader Act occurred, we had a lot of great doctors who were educated in the East and in Chicago, and they moved out to great states like Montana, where I grew up. And in the late 1800s, and by 1910 or 1920, they were still practicing old medicine that they learned in 1880, and things had changed. So the American Medical Association went through this huge conundrum of trying to get them to refresh their skills. So thus created something called CEUs. And they began to set up more standards of professionalization. Boards were held, and then we moved into specialty things from general practice and stuff. Airline industry did the same thing. After World War II, the airline industry began to explode. And as you know, in the 1950s, every famous person we knew died in an airplane crash. Why did they die in an airplane crash? Because pilots coming back from World War II knew very much how to pull back, see blue, push forward, see ground. But when something happened on board that airplane that was out of the ordinary, a fire, they lost a generator, a stabilizer, a flap went out, the plane crashed. They didn't know how to handle it. So there was no way of keeping good currencies on emergency procedures and things like that as we move forward. So they created simulators, environments where people could do professional training and do performance-based training. And that's the key thing that I think that's missing out of cybersecurity, is an ability to do that type of stuff. Because you can't practice the real threat or practice adverse conditions on a live network. You couldn't do the same thing in the airline industry. You couldn't take off with passengers on board and start the engine on fire and practice how you land the plane. So a couple years ago, the fruition of all that great event occurred when a guy named Sully Sullenberg landed a 757 on the Hudson River and saved everybody on board. Because it became second nature. He knew exactly what to do. He didn't think about it. He didn't open up a manual or anything like that. And in cybersecurity, I firmly believe the profession needs to move, especially in those major critical skills. You can't think about it anymore because your adversary is so adverse, things happen so fast. And that's why why I firmly believe as we move forward, we need some type of standardized professionalization movement. And the cyber insurance industry, all 17 carriers in the United States who offer it, are going to begin to demand it as they do actuarial costs and things like that to insure people's data, and the American public are going to demand it.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. That was very helpful to give an overview and a lot of foresight in terms of looking through and seeing ahead on these issues. I want to ask the panel here, first for general observations, and then secondly, how does this impact and affect your day-to-day lives? Phil, I mean, you were at a small company that has no cyber workforce called Microsoft. You were at a small department at the Department of Homeland Security overseeing a bunch of the cyber efforts. And now you're even at a smaller company that also has no intellectual property or cyber-related issues. I mean, how does this meet your needs? Where do you see the priorities going forward? What are the greatest gaps? And how can some of these students are going to be the next folks driving this, whether it's great programs such as Lance's at the department out of engineering or in all the other schools? How are they going to start filling that breach, filling that gap? Where are we?
So let me start with the notion that I think the report is right. As I read it the past few days, you know, I've been on commissions and reports and stuff like that over the course of years, and I have on more than one occasion argued that maybe one day it makes sense to professionalize the cyber workforce, but that day is not here yet. You know, I have lots of different people who work for me in the field of cybersecurity, and you know, some of them do jobs that overlap. In a Venn diagram, they don't cross at all, other than the fact that cybersecurity appears in their titles. And so I think it's hard to standardize on anything like that. You can't. The person who does cybersecurity for a dry cleaner is different from the person who leads cybersecurity for Northrop Grumman or Lockheed Martin or one of those things. It's just different, right? And we may get to a point where we want to professionalize different parts of it, and we may want to start to do pieces of that now, but it's really, it's still a little bit too immature. I mean, I think I will say, you know, the overlining problem, sort of the overarching, problem we've got in cybersecurity right now is that attack beats defense. Technically, there's no clear way to solve the problem, and so if somebody wants to get into your networks, they will get into your networks. Technology can help with the problem, process can help with the problem, but neither solves the problem. And what that means, what the conclusion that leads me to, is you've got to have good people. You absolutely have to have good people. And so what do all of us in this field do? We try to find the good people who work for our friends, and we try to steal them from our friends. And so, you know, how do we hire? Do I look for whether somebody's got a CISSP or a law degree? Mostly no. I mean, it's a useful way. I'm a CISSP. I don't want to undercut the credential. I've got a law degree. I'm a certified member of the bar and all of that. But I look for those things as relevant pieces of data, but they're not gates, right? What the gates are what does my network tell me about them? And when I bring them in to do the interviews, what do my technical or other experts tell me when they do a direct interview? That's what matters. And what I need is, I mean, I think we ought to work on certifications. What I want is more people. I want more geeks. You send me all the geeks you can, and I or somebody else in this field will hire them. And I don't care if they've got an advanced degree from Georgia Tech. I'll pick on them because Cy was on the report, or MIT. I don't care if they got a community college degree. If they know their way around a kernel, and they can tell me about buffer overruns and different ways to attack, and they've got the skills to get the job done, they've got a job. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. They can get a job being paid a lot more than a lot of people who come out with PhDs. And so I would tell kids, go into cybersecurity, learn the tech, learn how systems work, and the rest of it can come with time.
Thank you, Phil. And I might note, in addition, though, to that dry cleaner versus Lockmart or Northrop or the big firms, there is also, using the medical analogy, though, just washing hands saves lives. So you need physicians, but you also need some of the basics for everyone to do. Tony, you were at at an agency that knows a little bit about cyber. It's in the news a bit these days. I'm not going to ask you any of that. But,
Thanks. I'm not going to answer any of that.
How about some thoughts? I mean, when you talk about the most sophisticated capabilities, I agree with Phil. You may disagree, but the initiative will remain with the attacker. We're never going to fully firewall our way out of this problem.
Sure. We've
got to be ready for the fact, assume you're breached, and then figure out how to work your way around that. Where do you see this going? Do we need more folks that Fort Meade his training and Cybercom needs to draw on, or do we need more that can be part of that overall workforce, or is it all of the above?
Maybe all of the above. So just, my perspective is a sort of lifelong practitioner, right? I'm a product of the development systems at NSA, helped guide and found some of the programs that produce the people that are working this business today. And so, but I'm also old enough to remember when this business was primarily technology driven, right? Quaint old terms like ComSec, computer security, information security, right? Doesn't it seem hopelessly outdated now? But that's the world that I grew up in, where the focus was on, if we just build a better technology, everyone will throw away their pesky Windows desktops and the Microsoft Office, and they'll leap to a, B1 evaluated Binford 9000 or whatever the model was going to be that was going to save us. Somehow that didn't happen. So the shift in focus from the information security problem, I'll call it, as a technology-driven one, to one that has to recognize the marketplace and the skills of the people to execute, has been one of the big, I think, meta trends over the last couple of decades. But the thing that really changes the perspective for me is, for my world, starting in the mid to late 90s and then beyond, is the emergence of what I would call the operational mission. All right, this is not about buying better technology. We are in a minute-by-minute, day-to-day fight. And so the skills of not only the technology, but the decision-making and the offense-defense trade-off, that shapes sort of everything, right? And that leads a lot of us to think about, wait a minute, I need people with hands-on skills. If you can talk to me about security, that's great. If you could design me security, that's great. But I need someone who can touch the machine, right? Who can reverse engineer, who can look at packet flow and make sense of it. So that has really driven a lot of our decision-making and our thinking, and that comes down to jobs. This is about the kind of missions that we need. I know it sounds a little impolite to say, but all jobs are important, but not all jobs are mission critical. And so we have to focus our attention, I think, on the things that really are the make or break. That's where our shortages are, right? It's not there's lots of great people supporting the activity and helping us organize it and providing all kinds of essential things, but mission criticality is the way that we focused on this. So after I left NSA, one of the first volunteer things I did was involved with Mike and others on the DHS Cyber Skills Task Force, and that gave me a chance to reflect back on 3.5 decades and realize a couple of things. Sort of how did folks like me get to where we did, but also realize those times will never happen again, right? We don't get in a big system like an NSA. You bring people in, you typically put them in 3-year internships, you have mid-career refreshers, right? The workforce is stable, they don't leave very often. How rare is that going to be today, right? We need people ready to go. We need better products sort of on the input side and a better way to manage this influx of new information and make it part of the job. So a lot of big challenges in front of us here. As far as the report goes, I think it is a solid and useful starting point, but for me, it doesn't help further discussion that we need to have nationally, right? Because it literally answers the question that they were asked. The real issue is, what would the second report look like? Because I think we have enough elements. Diana hinted to this, right? There are jobs that we know more about than we did 10, 20, and 30 years ago, that there is, in fact, some bit of knowledge that we need to codify, make sure everybody have a way to vet that, have a way that others can know that. We can't do it across the board. Cybersecurity is this year's buzzword, or several years, right? Remember ComSec, InfoSec, information security, information assurance. I got all the badges. I got all the placemats. We're now cyber, and it's new. People use it as the all-purpose word because it's easier than trying to figure out exactly what I'm talking about. So we throw in like every job from policy person to guru in there. That's not helpful. We do need to take that understanding of what are the missions that really matter, what are the jobs that matter against those missions, and then the approach that we recommended in the task force report that I'm involved with now with the Council on Cybersecurity is, what does it take to execute those jobs, right? We're at a kind of a funny stage where a lot of our sort of knowing and doing is not codified, right? And we all have folks that working for us, Mike, Phil mentions them, I'm right. We're not the same level of wizards as the people that we hire. But we've got a lot of experience. We got judgment. We've made a lot of mistakes. So we do pretty good, though, at sort of spotting bad science from good science and enlisting the help of others when we're over our head technically, right? So sort of find the people. So we don't have the knowledge codified, but we have hired some very good practitioners, people that work magic. The question is, how do I get a lot more of them without waiting for magic to happen? It means I got to find them, gather them together, walk them through. How do you do this? What do you know? What are your skills? And do this not in a superficial way, but in a deep way where we can understand what constitutes success here. So I think the follow-on to this, I have no idea whether there's a plan for a follow-on, but I think the interesting discussion starts in after this, which is in fact we know we have a need, right? We can't do it across the board, but we have a need to codify information. It's unclear where the leadership ought to come from or how it'll happen. We can't be passive, right? We can't wait for technology to evolve and then see what happens to the people. The approach our council has taken is, if we don't think of them both at once, a big role of technology is to help people make good choices and avoid bad choices. And so we need to work these both actively at the same time so we can minimize, we can't teach everyone to be a surgeon, right? We need frontline health workers, we need the family practitioners, we need specialists.
Websites.
So we've got to figure this out in a way that lets us distinguish and focus our energy where we need to. So I don't mean to rattle on, but so again, I think that the report is just to summarize, a solid contribution. It states kind of the baseline. It answers the question, but I think the really important discussion is what we do nationally after that. There's no question we need to start moving actively in these, not wait for this to evolve, not wait for knowledge to stabilize. I know some of Diana's concerned. Some of her results have been cartooned a bit in the telling of the tale, but. Guess what? We're in a field where the knowledge isn't going to stabilize. I don't see it happening. So if you're in that kind of field, there's some base core knowledge. But then it says our concern is, how do we make the latest knowledge available to all the practitioners in an actionable way, right? It's not the teaching, it's the infrastructure that allows that to be found, identified as the best practice, for example, and put in people's hands. Then we need some national machinery that's sort of beyond the educational part to put that in place. So. Peace.
Thank you,
Happy
Tony.
to look forward to your questions.
If I were to sum some of that up, it's also the art and the science. Because here's the reality. Technology changes, human nature doesn't.
Yeah.
And if you can find ways to look at different means to be able to apply that, ComSec, EW is the new cyber. So you're actually in the game now. Electronic, that's the next generation of cyber. So I would argue that experience and insights, and it's actually where they all come together.
The other thing I'll say, I'm not taking the question, but some of us, I know, I've been around the business also. How many things are we seeing reinvented now? In
Old wine,
it was amazing. I made light of starting
Old wine is good,
in the original computer security days, right, in the mid-'70s. But so amazing, brilliant people did a lot of amazing work back then. And then it's so painful to see rediscovery of basic practices in software engineering. And in system management and so forth. It's not that it is a complex problem with lots of threads. There's no clear singular ownership.
I want to pick up on Ron because it's also in the application. If you really go back in history, technology's always been ahead of its application. Whether it's the plane, it's how you use it in a strategic kind of way for battle. Whether it's gunpowder, it's how you use it and implement it and execute it from a TTP perspective. But Ron, you're dealing with this every day.
Sure. What is your next question? I have an idea what the next question should be. I would love to hear, or maybe we can talk about
let's go off because
closing question.
Yeah, because I think lots of folks would contribute to this discussion.
I think that is the closing
question. And I
think
a number of folks are working these kinds of things for the future. Let's
Ron, you're dealing with this at U.S. Secret Service. I've got to say that the Secret Service was well in front when we were talking public-private partnerships. Years ago, before we were calling it cyber, Secret Service stood up the New York Electronic Crime Task Force. Unfortunately, it was in the buildings after 9/11. I've had the opportunity to work with your folks for a number of years. You're dealing with this every day. What is your biggest demand? What is your biggest need? And the threat today comes in various shapes, sizes, and forms, ranging from nation states to criminal enterprises. What keeps you up? Lots.
Everything keeps you up. So just a couple of general comments. First, to reflect on the report. The report was rather refreshing to confirm a lot of the things that us who work in the field of practice kind of already knew from an anecdotal perspective. So it was nice to see real academic research draw conclusions that matched up what we saw from an anecdotal perspective. Just a few things. So if I went to the fields of engineering and science and physics in the practitioner realm, and I said, hey, give me an idea of what this thing called force is. And then I went over to the academic side and asked the same question. They would all say the same thing. They would say force is mass times acceleration. And then if I really wanted to needle on it a little bit, they would all say, well, it's a kilogram meter per second squared, and that's a Newton. And you'd go, okay, fine. But the interesting thing is, I could ask all of those communities and get the same answer because we'd be wrapped around one definition. There's about 100 people in the room here. I promise you, if I say, hey, give me a definition of cybersecurity, I'm not going to get the same F equals MA kind of a thing because it's not quite the same kind of thing. So interestingly enough, I was ready for Tony to go back to punch cards here, but
I do go back to
guess what? Yeah. So if I went back to punch cards that time and asked the same question, what's force? Guess what? I'd still get that same answer. So when you're trying to study any subject and the definition is amorphous, it really makes it difficult to get your arms around. And it makes me wonder, the discussion that we're having today, to go to your question and Montana to yours, what is this question going to look like in just 5 years? Because I'm not sure we know. Frank, I agree. The EW stuff is the next, because we've already got half of a foot in it already. So, yes, there's a problem with definitions and how do you professionalize something that you can't really agree on what it is. Big problem. Or big challenge. The other thing is, has anybody, I don't need a show of hands, but just think, how many of you have been to Black Hat?
I would like a show of hands.
Okay, so Black Hat is really, it's a little cultish at this point, but it is the biggest hacker convention. Are we ready? Certainly in the United States, but are we ready to say maybe in the world? Arguably.
It is.
Arguably.
You should ask who stays for DEF CON.
Well, okay, Black Hat slash DEF CON, correct. But the
visible public.
Absolutely. Now, if you've ever, so some of this stuff, you kind of have to get your hands dirty and you have to go see. But if you go down to Black Hat and DEF CON and you sit there and you mix it up a little bit, you will find out there are a ton of people that you want to hire that have never, the last time that they've been inside a classroom was when the Flintstones was on. So they're just not academically oriented. But I'm going to tell you what, don't discount that because they are fabulous practitioners and would blow circles past many people at the master's level of cybersecurity / computer science. Blow right past it. So that's something that needs to be paid attention to. I would love to hire a lot of them. Only problem is for my organization, difficulty getting them past the poly. So those are things that, okay, that doesn't mean that we're not going to try. It just means that folks in the room need to pay attention to those kinds of things. Critically important. And lastly, I want to speak to the whole idea of this dual hatting kind of a thing that the report alludes to. If you are a special agent with my organization or perhaps ICE or the Bureau or something like that, excuse me, you've got a couple of jobs going on. Because if you're sitting in one of our 141 offices around the world doing whatever you're doing, if you're in the Washington area, then you've probably got a lot to do with what's going on at a protective assignment for the president and vice president. If you're in Charleston, West Virginia, where I was for a little bit, or you're in our Los Angeles field office, or you're on one of our 33 task forces around the world, you're doing a bunch of other stuff. So now all of a sudden, you've got to do an electronic crimes investigation, which involves the capture of evidence, testifying in court, appropriate legal process, subpoenas, those types of things. But by the way, guess what? You've got to go do a surveillance tonight, or you've got to go on the plane to get a protective assignment. You have lots of other things that you are held to a standard for. So it really is you have to do more with a lot less. And I know people say that, but I think we've got to be smarter with less. Because less is probably the flavor of the day. And lastly, I'll say one more thing that oftentimes is lost in the nuances of what we call cyber, because it's certainly not in any definition, and it is certainly not in the whole F equals MA definition. If I hire somebody, I don't want to say I don't care how smart they are, because I do. After you've gotten through the process and you're where we need you to be, that's awesome, that's great. But I got to tell you something. The ability to have the social component and social skills to do two things: work in teams, get along with your colleagues, and be collaborative, is huge. Because the world is full of very smart cyber people who want to sit in the corner by themselves. That doesn't do me any good. So if you can't work across teams because you don't have the appropriate social skills, I almost want to say, I almost want to say I can't, because you're wrecking my program because nobody wants to work with you. So we cannot discount the social side of this, and I'm sure in Dr. Burley's work where she talks about the holistic part of this, that's a big part of it. Because if you're smart all by yourself, thanks, that doesn't do me any good at all. So I will tell you this: show up with a STEM degree, a great attitude, and a big cup of coffee. Thanks.
That a lot of those people that you would like to hire black hat fit that latter mold of don't work well with others. It's part of our challenge also, because they are still valuable assets.
Highly.
Right? And and you have to figure out how to get to that corner, get what you need from them, and then come back out to the rest of the world.
Can I also note there is another model, and my colleague Sharon and I wrote a piece with the head of this organization. The Estonians have the Cyber Defense League. So basically it's a reserve corps on steroids. In the event the balloon goes up, they are pulled in, so they're read into particular initiatives, sort of an NSSE kind of environment. So they're read into the particulars, but not on a day-to-day, because they won't pass the polys either. But they need those skills. Or if it's a CNE, if it's an exploit from Russia, they can support the Minister of Interior. So there are some other models that could potentially be brought to bear.
The Cyber Skills Management Initiative, one of their platforms is the surge capacity. So I know that they're working on those things as well.
And that's a way to bring in some that maybe would have a hard time with the background investigation. But let's not underestimate the background investigation. Insider threat's a real one too, I think. Mike, you've looked at these issues from a group that is supporting at the highest end of the capability for the U.S. government, but also for other entities. I mean, where do you see the biggest demands? And for students, who are you hiring? What types of people? What do you need right now to be able to meet your objectives and tactically and then strategically? Where do you see things going here?
Okay, so first let me congratulate you guys on turning out a good report and accepting the recommendations of some of the reviewers. So,
Any in particular?
Well, actually, they had, if you look at the back of the workforce groups that they interviewed and the workshops that they had and then the review team they had, it's a really impressive list of people that they talked to. But if you look around the world as a whole, and somebody said, hey, name 5 cyber experts. Tell me the names of 5 people that you would consider to be cyber experts. Most people would be really hard-pressed to come up with those names. If somebody said, hey, name an innovative aerospace pioneer, it's fairly easy to come up with names like Kelly Johnson and people who actually worry about things like F equals MA. And so I think we're evolving to a spot where we're going to have to identify those leaders, those pioneers in the field. Those people will stand up and be recognized as experts in the field and also communicators and leaders, so that people can say, yeah, this is a real profession now. This is where I'm headed, and they will serve as role models for the kind of people that I want to hire. So when the numbers of people that are out there, of jobs that are available, or how many people do we need? Do we need 1 million? No, I don't know. But there was a study done this summer, actually, where over a 90-day period they analyzed all the job recs that were out there. There were 13,000 jobs available online from July for that 3-month period. That's a 24% increase over 2012. So no matter how you characterize it, no matter how you talk about it, no matter what you call it, whether you call it information security or IA or whatever Tony called it 30 years ago.
I forget.
There's no doubt that the demand continues to increase. And some of those are students, some of those are experienced professionals, but we're hiring the people that are good learners. If there was a cyber professional degree or a cyber professional characterization, I never would have got the job that I have right now as the Chief Information Security Officer for Northrop. Because I'm an aerospace engineer, I'm a systems engineer, I'm an integrator, and to me, cyber is about integrating lots of different things. So I think that's got to be part of it as we move forward. How do you characterize what those jobs are? And I'm hiring high school students now. I'm hiring them during the summertime. We're hiring them out of the Cyber Patriot program, which we support. And we're trying to let them know that there is a career path in cyber, all the way from high school through college, whether it's 2-year college, 4-year college, advanced degrees. And that means that you have to take that next step. And that's what the recommendation here really is identify what those roles are. We've done a lot inside the company. Tony and I have worked on the same thing for DHS, where it's starting to form around itself. It's starting to understand that when this job rec says cyber systems engineer, people are starting to think, okay, I know what that means. That means I'm going to have to integrate a lot of stuff. I might not be a cyber operator where I've got hands on keyboards, but that might mean that I've got to look for an architecture, an IT architecture, and a defensible network that I can build. So we're starting to see them coalesce around that. And I think as we come to professionalizing those jobs, that definition and those role models will be real critical in setting that up.
Diane, anything you want to respond to here?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think first I want to highlight the point about this volatility within the field and the fact that knowledge doesn't necessarily stabilize. Because while that may be true in some of the different occupations, that still doesn't mean that we need to ignore the fact that knowledge doesn't stabilize and that we can professionalize in kind of not keeping that in mind. What we have to do is once the different occupations are identified, even if it's an occupation where we're constantly evolving the knowledge and the state of knowledge, what does that mean for this question of professionalization? It may mean that we need to ensure that individuals within that occupation for which knowledge continues to evolve need to be held to continuing education requirements at certain intervals where the experts in the field say, you know what, things stabilize or things evolve every 12 months or every 6 months or every 18 months. But those continuing education requirements need to be designed in a way to keep pace with the evolution of the required knowledge and skill set for the individuals within that occupation. And I think that's the example that really highlights our point in this report, if we can boil it down to one point. We're not saying don't. We're not saying don't ever. We're not saying do it in a particular way or don't do it. What we're saying is that for each individual occupation, we have to define the professionalization requirements such that they meet the deficiencies or the characteristics of that particular occupation. Because if we don't, we will run the risk of applying standards that don't fit, that don't help us remediate the deficiency, and that in fact may do more harm than good in our efforts to develop the workforce. I also just want to highlight that all of the panelists represent very large entities, and that is a critical voice, but it's not the only voice. And so while we're making decisions about what to do with regard to developing the workforce, we also have to recognize that there are a significant number of small enterprises that have cybersecurity needs that may not be met with a team of cybersecurity professionals, that may not be met with a single sole cybersecurity professional. There are small governments, there are small organizations, there are school districts, there are all of its spectrum. And so when we talk about the report, we took that term, the nation's cybersecurity workforce, very seriously in recognizing the breadth of that workforce. And while we may think that the highly technical or that aspect of the workforce is of most relevant, certainly in this conversation here, they are not the only portions of the workforce, both in terms of the character of what they do and the context with which they do it, that need to be considered when we're talking about the nation's cybersecurity workforce. But as we move forward, and I appreciate Tony's point and comment, and he's right, and this was a baseline report. We answered the task that we were given, but there are next steps to be made. And what we're suggesting as we move forward, and that's where those criteria come in, is that we look at each occupation and apply those criteria and make the decisions about professionalization that make sense for those occupations considered independently or individually, maybe not independently, but certainly individually.
I mean, looking forward, and I'd be curious what everyone's thoughts are here. Obviously, institutions of education, higher ed, all the way down to K through 12, and everything in between has a role to play here. But I'd be curious, where do we see, to your point, the nation's approach? I mean, big companies started in basements. I know some of that's lore, but not all of it. Do we see the net, and quite honestly, that's what makes, I think, our country unique, is and innovative and entrepreneurial, that a good idea can stick. A good idea can stick and someone else can make money off of it, maybe not the originator of the idea, but ideas do make a difference. Where do we see this? Is it going to be driven from the private sector? Is it going to be, or is it going to be government? I mean, by and large, I think up until now, government was probably further along. Most people went in, then they'd leave and make 2x whatever they were doing in government. I'm not sure that model is sustainable, and I'm not sure it's even the right model. When we look at cybersecurity, I think active defense, the ability to defend your own systems, I think companies are going to start doing that regardless of what government thinks or wants, because they have to. They can't afford to lose their intellectual property. They can't afford to DDoS attacks on a regular basis. Who's going to drive this? Bill?
Well, I mean, I think the private sector will do what the private sector needs to do. The question for the government is, I mean, it's almost one of national economic competitiveness, right? Does the United States want to continue to play with all of the other nations around the world who are continuing to grow cyber workforces? And if you don't, then you're going to gradually atrophy. I mean, so I work for Sony. Sony's an international company. We hire people all around the world. I'll hire wherever the talent is.
You got a lot of great gamers, right, who are already part of that.
Right, so you kind of, do you want to play? Do you want to continue to be a participant? And if you give me the people, I'll hire the people. So the private sector is going to do what it needs to do. If the government wants to continue to talk and think about different things, and that's all great, right? But what matters, I think what will matter the most is treating this like a real priority. I mean, I think the government can be in the game. The government, to go to the question, what comes next, right? So I think the government should make the U.S. government and every government around the world, I'd say the same thing to everybody. STEM education ought to be a top 5 national priority. And I'm not kidding. I would say top 3, right? But I think I'll walk it back to say top 5. It really ought to be a top 5 national priority, along with things like energy independence, right? Because that's going to drive more national economic competitiveness over time than just about anything else. I don't think we need to worry too much about defining things. I think we need tactical programs that produce people. So like Tony and some other organizations are involved in things like Cyber Aces. The private sector is developing programs that are designed to produce operators, right? And those people will get hired. I will say,
it's done.
There's one thing I'll just put on my former government hat for a moment. If government wants to continue to get people, then Congress needs to get serious and give all of the civilian government agencies the cybersecurity personnel hiring authorities that DoD has, so that they can step out, do accepted service hiring, give special pay, special benefits, special flexibilities, because otherwise, those people, there's not a person with talent who works for one of the civilian government agencies who can't walk out the door and get at least 50% more than they get. Maybe double, maybe triple what they get in government. So,
and I think there is some legislation up there, if I'm not mistaken, that Clark's legislation does address or attempts to address one of those deficits. That is a legitimate enabler, I think, that leaning forward, giving my view, but I am a policy guy, so yeah, I support the ability to be able to do precisely that. Tony, I mean, where do you see this coming? I mean, you were at the you were at the center
at the Big Gorilla
before it was cool.
Before it was cool. That's the slogan. Right? We were cyber before it was cool. So as I mentioned, I'm a product of a system, right? But the conditions that allow that system to thrive don't exist anymore. So, quick anecdote: I actually started as a mathematician at NSA. Absolute mediocre. Decided to switch to computer science when the government would buy me an Apple II Plus to have on my desk. That was pretty cool. Mathematicians excommunicated me, but continued to talk to me. But I decided that was just a more interesting field for me. This is like 1980 or so. But I remember getting in a heated debate. And this is almost laughable. Now, I'm sharing an anecdote here. I became a deputy division chief. So I had 20 or 30 people working for me analytically on the defensive side. And I know this will sound shocking, but I thought it would be a good idea if every person had access to the internet from their desk. Okay, and this was 1992 or so, something like that. And
so we can blame you.
The chief oh, sorry.
For being overworked.
So the chief mathematician for information assurance was, when that word got to him, he was so shocked. He came running down to my desk to yell at me. And his words were, they're still burned in my memory, what could we possibly learn from the outside that would be worth the risk of unclassified terminals in our workspaces? And some of you know exactly, have been part of that conversation. I said, I won't mention his name, but the entire analytic capability in network security is sitting right next door for the IA mission. And if I counted generously, there's 10 people. There's hundreds of thousands outside of this building because rank amateurs. Remember, we're the king of crypto, right? Or NSA. And that's when you decided the problem was one way. But I turned to him at some point, and we talked about, I stand in awe of the mathematics community, NSA, believe me. Great body of knowledge, right? Great history, heroes and villains, all kinds of things that go with that. But he finally turned to me in exasperation, here comes the end of the story, and he said, when are you computer guys going to do what the math community has done over the years? When are you going to do this? He was just exasperated. And I turned to him and I said, Mac, I stand in awe, et cetera, et cetera. Never again, though, in our history will we get 4 decades of uninterrupted monopoly to build our own career field. And to pretend that we will is just folly, right? We will never, those conditions don't exist. We have to do this in a much more open, public way, right? Using skills that are common outside, in a different manner, right? And so if we treat this the way government treats it, we will hire the kids out of school, we will train them uniquely to us, they will stay with us for 30 or 40 years, we can refresh their training mid-career. How many of you live in that environment now, right? With that kind of stability, with that kind of resources that you can invest. Doesn't happen anymore. So we can't, Phil's absolutely right. I would extend what he said about, every enterprise will do whatever they have to do. It's also true for government, right? We'll steal from each other. We'll do whatever. But the role for the government, I think, is help bring. We've got to bring some order to this chaos because this is a common problem, and we can spend the rest of our careers, stealing from each other, or we can figure out what is the national imperative here, right? And that's the role of. By the way, if we have a more mobile workforce, more change, we also need a way to recognize that people have the right skills when I go get them. And I need a way to scale that, right, which is the role of some of these more formal programs to identify and certify and all that kind of stuff. We need that kind of infrastructure to allow us to get the people, and as it evolves, to know that they have the continuing growth that Diana talked about to get us to the job that as it evolves. So that's what I was talking about, sort of the follow-on, right? What's the next big step? How do we make the decisions as to the jobs that matter?
Let me ask, because this is, the poaching is an issue. It always has been. After 9/11, everyone was poaching for limited intel analysts. There's only so many world that everyone was seeking. But is there a Goldwater Nichols, like, because I mean, at the end of the day, there's the work, the career path, the workforce, the professionalization of that. It's hard to be able to get promoted across not only your own alphabet soup, and we tend to look at the world through our boxes and org charts rather than understand the world and then figure out the boxes in reverse. Yeah. But is there something there from a Goldwater Nichols? Because it's okay. I don't mind someone from the Department of Energy who really understands the latest and greatest in terms of grid security going forward, spending some time at, you name the department or agency, or vice versa. I think that, or Secret Service. I mean, Secret Service, the NSSE process is probably the most sophisticated process for fixed events. The problem is cyber's 24/7, 365, on all the time. You can't have that environment in a similar kind of way. But it would be great for someone who understood to get down to the greatest level of granularity and specificity to protect the commander-in-chief or POTUS or in a particular event, to be able to apply that then even inside DHS at another component. Do we need to start thinking in those terms? I mean, Ron, here's the thing that I think most people join government because they want to contribute. They want to make a difference. They want to serve. That's going to be the biggest enabler for people coming. You are there because you want to serve and you're doing an important job. Looking forward, though, are the real jobs going to be in government in this? Who's going to make the biggest difference? I mean,
so I think there are lots of different ways to serve. Your initial comment about who is going to do this, is it going to be this, the private sector? It's
I give away my answer.
Yeah, it's going to be both. In particular, if you work for an organization that is very mission driven. That if there's an event, no matter what the event is, no matter what the time, no matter where in the world, you've got to respond to those things. I think it changes your orientation, and it is generally inculcated with the people within that culture. If you've got a 9-to-5 culture that comes with certain things, if you've got a 24-hour, like, what don't you understand about we need to get this done, then that also inculcates certain things. So when you talk about the NSSE events, we learned a lot from our electronic crimes task forces. That is a synthesis of law enforcement professionals, academia, and the private sector, all coming together to leverage the deficits that, from the other organizations that are there. And one of the things that happens in government all the time that has it's sometimes I think it's contributed to poaching, and other times I think it's kind of mitigated it, is the whole idea of JDAs, Joint Duty Assignment Officers. I know within my organization we have people from every other organization that sit in our space, and of course we loan people out to other organizations, and that is one of the best things that we've done, at least in the past couple of decades. So it's being able to leverage the strengths of other organizations, and it doesn't cost you anything. Big deal, huge deal.
I get to disagree with everybody.
Good.
I know you like that.
I do.
So I'll tell you who's driving. I don't think it's the private sector, and I don't think it's the government. I think it's the threat. I think we are in total responsive mode right now because the theft of intellectual property started along that path, and that started an entire industry about firewalls and about how to defend against those kind of attacks, malware, reverse engineering, and created a need for those experts. Then came the denial of service attacks, and that created the need for the ISPs to get smart about that and how to respond and how to build technology that would detect and respond. And the next thing is going to be attacks on our critical infrastructure. And while we haven't had a lot of those yet, if that comes next, that will drive a need for people who understand how to create secure power plants and water systems and transportation systems. And so I think we're in responsive mode. I think we're building as we go to defend against a threat.
I actually think sober and makes a whole lot of sense. Now, the one thing I would throw in there, though, is the best way to predict futures is to shape it. So there are steps people can take to try to at least take the the biggest, the baddest, and push it off the table, or at least make it less likely. Bria, I'm going to turn it over to you because I want to get the audience in questions now. There's a lot of food for thought here, so Bria, you got it.
Okay. I think what we want to leave as much time for your questions as possible. So let's start with that now. Ron.
Yeah, Ron Marks, Senior Fellow here. Thank you. This is for Phil, since you represent the private economy, which is about 70% of the country's GDP. It's a small group outside of Washington.
Well, Michael does too.
Yeah, all right, we'll throw in Tony too.
And Tony says.
The question I would have for you is, I've heard a lot about STEM in the last couple of years. I advise a couple of organizations on how to commit to that kind of thing. And I've also been in the IT business long enough that when I'm hiring people, I'm looking for specific kinds of backgrounds, et cetera. But at the same time, how specific do you want to get on this, in the sense of when I'm talking to somebody who's in high school principals or districts, et cetera, I'm saying, hey, I'd love to have these kids sort of learn X, Y, and Z because I know that will generally prepare them. On the other hand, when I have a lawyer, by and large, those kids in school can be anything. They can take economics, they can take business, they can take English, and then they end up going to law school. If I'm dealing with a medical situation, that's a little more specific. Then I usually have kids taking pre-med, but even then it may be chemistry, it may be some other things. What exactly do you need for a pipeline at this point, if I can't think of a better way to do it? And what exactly could these guys in that other 20% do to help support that effort? Or do you think you guys can pretty much do that on your own?
No, I think it's worthy of a national effort to make being a geek cool. I would like people like the president going to high schools and saying, take math, take programming, study science, especially hard sciences, because we need poets, we need people who can do all of that, but the U.S. and every country around the world needs more people who can do math and hard science. And so I think, just sort of the overarching piece is really, I think there needs to be an advocacy effort around saying, look, this is really what we need. I want kids who are in middle school to think about mathematicians and hard scientists the way that we thought about, Neil Armstrong, right? The astronaut level degree of support, and this is who you want, right? We have too many people who want to be sports figures and all these other things, but we need people who want to be math and science. So that's one piece. The second thing is we do need more coders. We need more specifically people who can do that. And again, I think we're targeting probably too high. There are great programs out there to start teaching programming. There are special languages to get people starting to do coding younger. I think a lot more effort, along the lines of Cyber Aces is for people who are, after high school, right, to go through the program. We got to get people, there needs to be much more of an effort to get people doing coding at the middle school level. Because today's kids, in my experience, there's there are a lot of people, you can find them at Black Hat and DEF CON and some other places who know the internals, right? But, the average college kid, understands cars the way, people have come to understand cars. 30 years ago, kids could, work on the engine. It was that they knew the car, right? Now they know how to drive, right? And we're at the same place with cyber. Well, yes. Okay. My kids are 10, so I'm not going to make it.
Driving.
We've got to get people into that, and I don't want to sound, even though my father was a Southern preacher, I don't want to sound like a Southern preacher, right? But it really is about that, and we need evangelizing this. When Tony was talking before, I almost said, "Can we have an amen from the congregation?" Right? And I want that. I want people out there talking about it. So that's, and I think we need to put money at the problem. We need to put.
I understand your thoughts. We live in the generation, the millennials, whatever you want to call them, Generation Y, Generation Millennial, the Nexters, or whatever, we had all these names for them. The social media aspect and the role of television and the media. And there are many television shows out there, and this is one of the things I've always struggled with. There are many television shows out there that do things cyber-related, that are STEM-related. There are activities going on, but they're never talking about them. It's never really highlighted, and I think a lot of things go by missing. Abby I would like Abby from NCIX just to be the national spokesman. I mean, she has the look of, the wild look of everything, but what things that they do on shows like that, but you don't really, I don't think people totally understand it because it's not particularly highlighted. And the words like cybersecurity are not necessarily always used. The opportunities are not talked about in careers. And I think leveraging, like you said, the evangelists, we need to get evangelists from all aspects talking about this problem. And sir, you are dead on correct. It has to go that way. We got to get people inspired, just like, I remember, I wasn't that old, but I still remember Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. And that was a pivotal event in many of our lives who are almost 50 years old. Okay.
The one thing I just want to add, and I want others to give their thoughts on that, but every issue has made that same argument. I remember when we were working Y2K, they were thinking at that time Michael Jordan had to be the spokesperson for some of these issues, or Mickey Mouse, or whatever it may be. I don't disagree with that, but there are tons of successful stories. What I'd like to see is more women in this workforce. Father of 4 daughters. But the reality is,
tuition plan.
You name the issue, they will say a similar sort of thing.
Yeah.
And TV does make a difference. I would imagine every Law and Order show, everyone wanted to be a prosecutor or a defender when those shows were out, or ER, you name it. So.
Right, let me just, because there are a number of efforts underway. I mean, part of what the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education is all about is awareness, trying to increase the number of students going into STEM and cybersecurity careers. The National Cyberwatch Center, which is something that we at GW are involved with, has a number of different initiatives that focus on bringing cybersecurity into students. It has been shown through the research that you have to get to the students when they're in middle school, particularly for girls and students from minority populations, that you need to get them and you need to get the role models in there, because saying that a student should take more math doesn't really do it. But it's showing them how people who look like them are doing these different activities, and that these were the things that they needed to do, and the building blocks for getting into those career fields is important. So there are efforts underway. I would say that part of the effort that needs to happen as well is there needs to be push on the states, the curricular standards that are in the public school systems for middle schools and high schools. Remember that the teachers have to teach certain material.
There's more schools teaching Latin in high school now than there are cybersecurity.
But that's not a function of what the teachers want to do. That's a function of what the state standards say that they must do. So it has to be an effort that is, my word, holistic, but there has to be an effort at each piece of this this puzzle in order to affect the kind of change that we're looking for. But efforts are underway. It's not as if people aren't working on
But it's
them.
disjointed because all the states are different. They all have different
All the
requirements.
states are different, and they all have different requirements. That's right.
You see, but no kid is thinking their job as a young. That's the point. You do have to have that cool factor, and I can't believe I'm going to pitch Estonia again. But in kindergarten and first grade, their kids are learning coding. It's cool. In gymnasium, their high school, they're given a tablet. They're given a week to break into the school system and identify all the vulnerabilities. It's cool. There is a hacker for good. I'll put my ideology on the table maybe, but the Jester is a very prominent hacker that's causing others. He's going after terrorist, foreign terrorist organizations, designated FTOs. That has a cool factor, but that's kind of to my crowd, not the next crowd. So the question is it really the person, or is it, I don't know. I've just heard the same argument in every field. That's my only takeaway. Let's open it up to other questions.
Hi, I'm Jess Hutcher. I'm an Army fellow working at the Office of Director of National Intelligence. My question is for anyone on the panel, really. We just touched on it briefly, but as you're looking to professionalize the workforce, I've heard a lot of talk about wanting skilled, smart people, but are you also looking at the insider threat vulnerability aspect of it, because you also want mature people that are going to protect and be loyal and committed to the organization that they are working for. So is there any look at having any type of ethics type training, not just training on if you do this, you're going to go to jail, but, you know, that's building that, if, you know, support for, you know, the effort in, as a whole.
If they break the law, they should go to jail.
I want to talk to this for a second because I think it's a great point. I think what has happened up to now is, especially in government, and certainly if we look at the lessons of the last few months, there's been a tendency to assume that if you wanted to work for the government, that you automatically understood the issue of ethics here. I'm not sure that would have changed the outcome of our recent situation, but I certainly think that you need to have a culture of certain values, and you need to inculcate that to your workforce at the beginning. When you fail to do that, you will eventually have people who no longer feel either they belong or feel that they support those values anymore. And I think we're seeing an outgrowth of that, so it's a great point.
Anyone else want to take this?
I just wanted to jump back on Phil's his upbringing as the preacher's son. And it made me think of, when I think about kids, I'm sorry, Renee Forney, DHS Cyber Skills. It made me think about when I begin to talk to children, I think of speaking to them in a way where I'm meeting them at their need. Because the reality is that we're telling children, oh, go take this science class, go take this math class or whatever, and they can't see where that leads them. What does that really mean to me? Mom said, oh, I need to take this class. Well, what am I going to do with that? So in some of the conversations that I have with children, I try to break it down to a level for which they can understand. Being a mother of teenagers, I truly believe at some point I'm going to have the cell phone surgically removed from my daughter's hand. And I utilize that to to use that as an avenue to communicate to them. Because we're facing two major problems here: to grow the pipeline, but also the immediate need of the ones who are right at the door and we're trying to get them into the career field. How do we operationalize that? How do we deal with the hiring issues and the hiring practices around that? So that's one issue, but that overarching issue of how do we grow this seemingly empty pipeline at this point? I would agree with you that we have to start much earlier. When I think about it from a perspective of not even starting at the middle school, because if you have kids who aren't taking those basic core math and science foundational classes, now will find themselves in the middle school and they have to take the general math because they can't take the advanced math. So why are we starting so late? We have to rectify that holistically in order to accurately fill that pipeline. One of the things that that has come out through some of our studies is that in dealing with some of the universities, they are having a challenge of finding students who can make it through those curriculums of those stronger, those heavier math and science courses. Well, we have to prepare them. High school, middle school, elementary, because you can't wake up in 11th grade and say, oh, I'm going to take physics. That's just not going to work. You have to have basic core foundational skills taught at an earlier age. So I really think that that's something foundationally that we need to rectify, within the country in order to help build that pipeline, as well as deal with the issues of the kids who are right there. We're trying to get them in the workforce. How in the world do we get through archaic systems that are in place that fit 1970s? I know I constantly said that I constantly say this at the department. We cannot hire not 2013 skills with a 1970 PD with a position description from 1970. The two just doesn't match. We have to work at fixing that. So Tom.
Just a quick thought. Phil's mentioned cyber aces a couple times on this whole pipeline issue, right? And there are long-term things we need to do, and then there's shorter-term things that we need to do. So cyber aces, takes Diane's word holistically, I'd say systemically. You have to look at this as this is not just a teaching problem or a hiring problem. It's the whole cycle, right? So what CyberAces does, one of the things that came out of the DHS report last summer was around we have to expand our notion of the pipeline, right? It's not just from traditional four-year schools, but we've got to think about more creatively. And one of the approaches is around mobilizing the community college system. Okay, that's the place where you find career changers, separating veterans, a different kind of population. If we don't tap some new populations, we're never going to get there. So what CyberAces does is focuses on kind of designing the whole system. And here's the challenge when you have career changers and sort of non-traditional folks. How can you identify the aptitude and the interest if they don't have traditional credentials, right? They don't have a CSP. They don't have a degree in computer science or math or whatever. How can you find them? The answer that we came up with, or that others came up with before me, was around tapping into the modern generation. I've raised three of them. Online gaming and simulation. So SANS provides NetWars is the kind of core SANS online gaming contest machinery that they teach classes in and run contests and so forth. That's used as the filter. All right. So and we found the states are kind of the right place to work this. Because you can get the political leadership, you can get the business development office, you can get local employers, you can get the educational machinery kind of lined up around the idea. And the governor wants to carry the flag, and that's all good. But the idea is invite these non-traditional populations to participate in the contest to help find the highest performers, right? And the game is set up to identify the skills that you want. Align that then, but many of those people that are going to be high performers are missing some key technical background. Use the community college system as the kind of home base for this to fill those gaps, what they don't know about operating systems, system administration, et cetera, to fill that gap. The SANS Institutes provide some specialized, the reverse engineering, the packet analysis kind of training. But this is leading to working with local employers to provide guided mentorship, right? You provide a mentor and a paying job at a beginner wage for a period of time, and it's all tuned to like 6 months to a year. And the idea is to build the whole pipeline, right, from identification, education, hands-on training, to guided employment. We're modeling some of the things like medical residencies and things like that, right? You have a degree, but you're not qualified except to work under the tutelage of someone more experienced. So the idea is to align these up. It's a great investment for employers, or at least it seems to be well regarded, because it lets you both invest to find a fresh pipeline, but also to try out new employees, right? To get work done, but this is roughly. I was involved in some of the conceptualizing, and an NSA can have a 3-year development program. Most companies, the SMBs and everybody else, nobody else can afford to do that, right? Big institutions can. So how do you get the equivalent effect? Multiple experiences, technical training, tutelage under the guise of a mentor, doing real work, not made up work. How can we build a national kind of structure? So community colleges are a tremendous opportunity because they're much more tuned to certifications, hands-on kind of activity. Many of them have relationships with either high-tech companies like the Ciscos that give them a gear or whatever, or local employers. So you have an opportunity to kind of think fresh about the way that we would do this. And by the way, many of their faculty are actually practitioners, right? They're not academics, with all respect to all my academic friends. These are people that are ex-military, retirees who are just looking to give something back. So you get a really different kind of perspective on the teaching mentoring. Right? We are seeing a generational change. My kids, we're trying to learn computer stuff from people who were 2 decades behind their kids, right? They didn't have the skills, and bless them, they're doing the best they can, but they're doing it with outdated equipment and with no training to help them, right? So as we see a generational change where old folks like me drop off the end of the employment and try to find something to give back, we got to find those people and get them working on this next generation, right? So that's kind of the notion of ACES, CyberAces. It's one of the programs, cyberaces.org if you like this kind of stuff. But it's we have to think systematically about how do I do this kind of start to finish, align this in a way that you don't have to be a government agency or a big dollar defense contractor to tap into. Folks like Mike, Mike invests a lot, right, in local schools and things like that to help build his own pipeline and contributes to these sort of national activities too.
And some of that early training goes back to making sure that the ethical considerations are taken into account, because it's one of the first fields where if you don't take the ethics up front, bad things can happen.
Right.
If you're another type of engineer, or if you're another type of mathematician, bad things don't happen up front if you don't think about it
Right.
ethically. But if you've got great power from a cybersecurity perspective.
Yeah, and this sort of notion also of this mentorship under someone who's in the business, right?
Yeah.
You know, Diane calls
Great.
out sort of codes of behavior or something, right? Or a fundamental, you know,
Creating a
we
role
have to get
model
there.
is
But
just
it's the
expected.
modeling, and if you grow up in a culture and your mentors are the people who want to steal my pee and, you know, and misuse credit cards and so forth, well, that's the behavioral norm, right? And so we have to get them into different environments.
Well, Sony knows a little bit about gaming too, right? Where do you see this going?
I mean, I think that's, and Tony's point is a good one. First, you know, community colleges are important, but I think if you do want to reach kids, and there are programs out there to do this now, in addition to cyber races, where they get kids involved in doing game programming, and that's a great entryway in. There's just one other thing I wanted to mention specifically in response to your question is, you know, I think maybe it'd be nice to have Michael Jordan. That's actually sort of not, although I say this is different because I'm right. It actually is important. But separate and apart from that, you know, what I would like to see is political leaders, the President, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Homeland Security, not just, I mean, and I know this is happening, but I'd like to see a lot more of it. Not just calling the team that wins the World Series, but attending the U.S. Cyber Challenge and being there to give the award to someone, to actually, you know, to generate stories and press and to have kids say, boy, that's kind of cool. I mean, I think the astronaut model is the right one. That's how we want kids to think about this.
I think that's great, and I think all of the answers are spot on. But there's also getting to the girls, the women, my children. Maybe it's Big Bird has a Twitter addiction is going to be an episode along those lines. It's going to affect my kids more than gaming. They just that's just their MO. Our trustee, here back.
Yes, I'd like to ask the entire panel a question that really involves George Washington University. I am a trustee, and I've been actively involved with this program, and that pulls together everything we're doing as a university, focusing on educating the cyber workforce of the future, research and development, as well as public policy. And this panel is all about educating the workforce of the future. So one of the things that we're looking at the Board of Trustee level and at the administration level is what additional courses should we be teaching here at GW that results in jobs to educate the workforce of the future. And I remember we had a dinner in the spring, and Suzanne Spalding was sitting next to me, who, as you know, used to run cybersecurity at DHS. And she said, I today could hire 600 people from GW if they had an interdisciplinary degree in engineering and public policy. And you know, we have a master's in national security law at the law school. We teach courses in cybersecurity law. We have a master's in engineering in cybersecurity. We have the only MBA, I think, in the country in cybersecurity, many courses in computer science. And we have now a PhD in cybersecurity. But clearly, one of the things we want to do as a university is, here in the nation's capital, we want to be a resource, not only to government, but to private enterprise. And we want to be involved with the NSA in terms of our graduates having jobs, DHS, and the corporate world. So what about this notion of an interdisciplinary degree in engineering and policy focused on cybersecurity? Or are there some other ideas for courses that we should be teaching here at the university to educate the cyber workforce of the future?
I'll say one brief, too much, but I'll say one brief comment. We've talked a lot about sort of this education, you know, both of practitioners, technicians, and sort of mass market and all that stuff. But I know a lot of folks have been thinking about leadership in this space and how to develop leaders. And I'll just offer an observation. So I'm actually a liberal arts kid, right? Math, economics, tiny little liberal arts college. Some of you, that's right, we're a support group. We all like each other. And when I looked around at the leadership team, what I think was a reasonably successful leadership team in the missions that I was in, about half the folks were kind of like me. They were not hard sciences for the rest of their lives, or they came from other fields. And you know, Mike's an example, right? Your technical degree has very little to do with the job that you're doing here. And so what are the attributes that allowed that to happen? And one of the conclusions I reached some years ago, and this was part of being in the culture of an NSA, is here's the slogan I use for it: no one boss has a rich enough variety of assignments in his organization, his or her organization, to develop the leaders of the future. Okay, And so the notion there was, and this was part of the embedded in the culture of where I grew up, the idea was we saw the model shift. People like me started in defense and never left. Other people started in SIGINT and never left. It was pretty clear, with the current director and his predecessor, that the world was changing, becoming more complex. And lots of us who were senior leaders started to look at each other and go, we need to start swapping our rising stars for a year, or for 2 years, or whatever, right? We need to start developing the people who will have the skills that we don't. This broader notion of missions was really important, having either different sciences in your background. I spent a couple years at Sandia Labs, surrounded by, heaven help me, engineers and material scientists and chemists. Not this kind of skills you found at an NSA. It was incredibly valuable, though, to study robotics and alternate power and to see how different sciences approached a problem. I wasn't smart enough to contribute to it, but I was clever enough to kind of observe and to see the cultural part of it. So the idea was we had to start finding and creating experiences to develop the folks that were going to succeed, folks like me, right? And realize that none of us had enough variety of jobs within our control and experiences to do that for the people that we thought were going to be the rising stars. So I happened to be in a culture where I could go to my peers and they would say, that sounds like a good idea. I'll swap you somebody, for a year, or we did lots of that kinds of stuff. And so, again, that's anecdotal and kind of one example, but I think it really paid off when I look at the people that are rising, that followed me. They are, in fact, have a very rich career history, some by design, some by accident, and not all of it is technical, right? They took time out of their career to go work policy issues or legal or whatever. So.
Can I jump in before you, Ron? I'm sorry. Because this is, in fact, the idea behind our new doctoral program, is that this notion of complexity, complex organizations, volatile, changing organizations, where the leaders within the cybersecurity space need to understand not just the technical aspects of the job, but they need to understand the dynamics within the organization and within the individual human resources within the organization. And so we're addressing that, we're answering that call, at least through our holistic executive cyber core program. So there were flyers out there. Bria mentioned it at the outset, but I wanted to make sure that I told you to pick up a flyer if you haven't already.
Two courses. Course number, I'm looking around at the relative age range of the folks in the room. But as I say, two courses. Number one, the management of cyber professionals. Nobody talks about that. So, I've had a number of supervisory assignments over my 22 years in the Secret Service, managing an office that the primary function is investigations and protection of the president is completely different than managing 100 cyber professionals. Completely. And there are different sensitivities. And you have to realize that oftentimes technologists have a tendency to be a little bit more, let's just say, that there is an attraction more so to the.
We're holding your every word here.
There is an attraction more so to the technology over and above the organization.
Different motivations.
Right.
Different incentives.
And so if you come from a managerial track that you don't recognize that and you're not sensitive to it, you get big trouble. And so that as a framework for study needs to be done. And I talked a little earlier about having the smartest guy in the room who's in the corner by himself or herself, can't work with anybody. And I have had experiences where I've had to deal with that, and you have to bring someone in and talk to them in a certain way. But that person, I'll tell you from a manager's perspective, is no good to me. You're killing me in my organization because no one wants to work with you. And I usually have something called the lunch test. If all the time everybody, hey, you want to go? Going to be a problem. And I know that that's a little bit of thin slicing, but it works. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is I have never seen, very rarely, will get someone out of college who kind of gets it right away. There are so many cultural things. My agency is different than the Bureau, which is different than DEA, which is different than, another agency. So what might be the right answer in one agency, probably not going to fly in another one. So I taught physics and calculus at the University of Pittsburgh many years ago before I did this job. And what I found out was, depending on who you got the calculus from, kept you or pushed you away. And I remember getting calculus many years ago in Montana from the folks that were in the mathematics department. And I'd say, well, what's really a derivative? And they go, well, it has to do with this curve and it's a tangent. And I go, whatever. And then I got it from an engineer who put a bottle of water down and said every little drip, and you added up the drips, and that's really a derivative. And if you add them up, that's an integral. And I went, oh, I get it. That's cool. So a lot of it has to do with how you explain the particular technologies. And if you can transfer that skill to speaking the same language of the folks that work for you, that's big stuff. Because that may be the tipping point of, you know what, I'm out of this place. They don't get me, I don't get them, and I'm gone. I'm going to agency X or private sector company Y. So that is really big. And the other thing is, how do you do that? How do you prepare someone so when they walk out of the doors of your academic halls, they're really ready to go? And I've thought about this a lot. The only way to really do it, I think, is what you do is you have a course and you get somebody like me or somebody like from the Bureau in the Cyber Division that comes in and does a couple of weeks with you and says, hey, I get that you're learning object-oriented programming, or I get that you're learning hacking techniques, or I get whatever. But you know what? This is what you really need. And this isn't written anywhere. And do that as a course basis. Anyway, that's my offering.
Let me offer some tactical suggestions, because one of the things we've been talking about, and I agree with the point about leadership development, but the problem here is really scale. We need not just leaders. We need privates and sergeants to take the hills. So one is we need cybersecurity courses and actual engineering programs, right? Because there's been a lot of resistance. One of the reasons why there's been a lot of movement towards community colleges is that traditional four-year universities really weren't interested in teaching cybersecurity because it's too tactical. It's vocational. We don't want to teach that. And I think it's really important. The second thing, and this goes to what Ron was just talking about, we need to teach engineers how to talk, right? You give me a techie who can talk to an executive, and they're worth their weight in gold. Also on the same point, put some cybersecurity, at least a survey course, in MBA and law school programs. There are statistics for lawyers programs, right? And public policy for lawyers. Just do the same sort of thing. And you see that's spreading much more rapidly than cybersecurity courses in four-year universities are. The last thing, if you want to talk about outside of engineering, there's a crying need for people who can do risk management. You can do risk management, and that's not just cyber. That's in critical infrastructure across the board. Risk management skills are really important.
Very valuable. One thing, the MBA is, in a soundbite, talk and squawk meets beep and squeak, because it is exactly that language convergence issue. But let me just say there's a huge workforce on vets in particular, veterans who've been doing this for a long period of time that don't necessarily have the degrees behind it. So there are many different ways to boil that ocean. We got time for literally one more question. All right. We'll let either Lance or Costas, who are running a great program for us at GW, after you.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Ferrantino. I work for the Office of National Capital Region Coordination. So your trustee asked a very pointed question, but I want to broaden that question because our interest is in gaps in the National Capital Region. What are the gaps? And I'm asking this to all of you because there's a broad range of answers. It's not a top-down approach we're looking at. It's not a bottom-up approach. It's a beginning, middle, and end approach to addressing this problem, as I understand. I haven't read the report yet. So what do you all see as the gaps? If you use the National Capital Region, we have 60 universities. We're hearing from one, and I applaud you for leaning forward to answer this question and address it. What are the gaps? If you use the National Capital Region as an example, what are the gaps in this region for cybersecurity for today, tomorrow, and the future? Something in 6 months, 12 months, or 18 months that we can begin to address now or begin to work towards addressing now. And obviously this committee is one of those things that is addressing it.
So I think the biggest gap that universities need to think about is what's their role in educating the cybersecurity professional? You know, because it starts with the staff on the university, and it starts with a vision from the university to say, I'm going to focus on this group of people because I've got a limited number of instructors, got a limited number of researchers that are knowledgeable about that field. I can't take all of cybersecurity and say, I'm going to teach everybody. I'm going to be one thing to everybody. I'm going to have cybersecurity technical experts who are going to be operators and are going to sit on consoles, people who are going to be architects, people who are going to be policy wonks, you know, all that stuff. Sorry, Frank. It's impossible to address it all. So I think each one of the universities needs to carve out their niche and start from something that's strong. And as a whole, the National Capital Region, if you think about all the schools that we have to bring to bear on this problem, could divvy up the problem, take their own cut at it, draw that center of excellence toward them, and then build on that piece. Because it's going to take a bunch of different kinds of people to solve this problem.
Anyone else? I would also recommend behind you, to your left, a couple seats down, Kyle is doing some very good work in the National Capital Region, looking at all of the gaps and shortfalls academically and from a private sector standpoint. So, when's your report coming out? Lance, you've got the last word.
Thank you, Frank. In answer to the question, we are doing some things here already that are being picked up around the country. We have a sister program, if you will, to Diana's program. She has the doctorate related to cybersecurity. We do have some doctoral students, but also a major program in the Scholarship for Service program funded by the National Science Foundation, where we have, in the last 10 years, put out about 70 people into the workforce, and they've all gone to the government. The interesting thing here is there's been a demand in recent years from people outside of this program, and we've had to broaden it. So in the computer science department, there's this one course where these people come in, and every week we have people come in, practitioners like you, come in, and they talk, and we've now started recently videotaping them. We're sharing that information with other people, other institutions around the country on a test basis, funded by the National Science Foundation. And there was such a demand recently that we instituted just last summer an online version of that course where we use the videotapes, but also people then come in and have a real session and so forth. That ran last summer. It's running in the online mode in the spring and in the summer as well, because in terms of scalability, there's a lot of people to educate, and they may not all get a certain kind of degree, but we do have a role in providing this kind of education. We're really lucky here. We call up our friends and say, hop on the metro and come on over and talk, and they do. Most people don't have that advantage, and we're trying to multiply that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lance. First, we want to thank our panel today. We really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on this. This is an area that we're going to continue to build out on, both in terms of GW and obviously across the country. We need your thoughts and your opinions. You'll see that we have a link to the event. You can look at the event. You can tell us your reactions. You can suggest other programs and other speakers. We're always open to that as well. I want to especially thank Dr. Diana Burley for presenting her report and for all the work that her committee did as well. And we thank all of you for coming on this rainy morning, and we look forward to having more discussions like this in the future. So have a good morning.
Thank you for service over the years. You guys are always